The grand ballroom of the New York Marriott Marquis buzzed with energy. Hundreds of passionate educators, students, reporters, and activists had gathered for the National Education Equity Summit, a day dedicated to addressing deep-rooted inequalities in the education system. The air was thick with hope and determination, every person eager to hear the stirring speeches and calls to action from leaders who promised change. Before we begin, tell us where are you watching from, also subscribe. At the center of this gathering stood Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, known to many simply as AOC. She commanded the stage with a polished confidence, her presence filling the room. As cameras from major networks, including MSNBC, zoomed in, she gripped the podium firmly and began her speech with conviction. "Education is the great equalizer," she declared, her voice echoing through the ornate room. "For too long, inequality has been baked into the system. It's time for reform. Systemic, unapologetic, and fully funded. We must invest in our children's futures, and we must do it now." Her words were met with thunderous applause. Signs waved high, bearing slogans like "Fund the Future" and "Equity Now." Supporters cheered, energized by the promise of sweeping government funding and transformative reforms. Everything was going according to plan, but then, from the side aisle, something unexpected happened. A young woman, calm and composed, rose quietly from her seat. Her presence was unassuming. Dressed in a royal blue blazer, a small silver cross hanging from a chain around her neck, her expression steady and clear. She was not on the guest list. She was not scheduled to speak. She was Karoline Leavitt. The murmurs began almost immediately. Who was she? What was she doing? The noise of the room dimmed as all eyes turned toward her. "I'd like to speak for 1 minute," Karoline said, her voice calm but firm. She didn't shout or demand attention. She simply asked for a moment to be heard. Gasps echoed through the crowd. The disruption was palpable. Even AOC, who had been passionately speaking just moments before, froze mid-sentence, her brow furrowed in confusion and irritation. "You're not on the program," AOC said sharply, her tone cutting through the silence. Security personnel in black suits moved swiftly toward Karoline, ready to escort her out. But Karoline stood her ground. "Just 1 minute for the kids," she said, her words hanging in the air like a challenge and a plea all at once. A ripple of reaction swept through the audience. A man in the back row stood up and called out, "Let her speak." Others murmured in agreement, while some voices countered, "Stick to the program." The crowd, once unified in applause and support, began to splinter. Phones emerged, recording the moment. Whispers and debates broke out among neighbors. The atmosphere shifted from orderly to charged. The guards hesitated, unsure whether to proceed. They glanced at AOC, who seemed torn, the political calculation clear in her eyes. Denying Karoline could alienate some supporters. Allowing her might invite unpredictable reactions. After a tense pause, AOC leaned into the microphone and said coldly, "1 minute. Don't waste it." The guard stepped back. Karoline nodded once, silently accepting the challenge. The room fell silent. In that moment, before she even spoke a word, the entire dynamic of the summit began to change. Karoline looked out over the crowd. Teachers, students, reporters, activists, all waiting to see what this uninvited speaker would say. Her voice was clear, steady, and strong. "Thank you," she began, "for giving me this minute. I'm not here because I want to interrupt or cause chaos. I'm here because the children we're fighting for deserve more than speeches. They deserve real action, real listening." She paused, letting her words sink in. "For years, I've seen how the system fails kids like mine. Kids who don't have access to safe classrooms, to books that reflect their lives, to teachers who understand their struggles. We talk about equity, but do we truly listen? Do we act beyond the cameras and applause?" The crowd leaned in. Karoline continued, "This isn't about politics or programs. It's about human lives. It's about the promise that education can be a ladder out of poverty, a doorway to opportunity. But that promise is broken for too many." Her voice grew quieter but no less powerful. "We don't need more speeches. We need courage. Courage to admit the failures. Courage to change. Courage to put kids before politics." As her final words echoed, the room was still. The guards looked unsure again. AOC's supporters were caught between loyalty and the undeniable truth Karoline spoke. Karoline's simple but unshakable truth had pierced the carefully constructed narrative. In just 60 seconds, she had shifted the room. and perhaps the national conversation. The room remained suspended in a heavy silence as Karoline Leavitt's words settled like a stone dropped into still water. The ripple of truth she'd cast began to spread, unseen but undeniable. For a brief, tense moment, the guards who had been ready to remove her held their ground. They looked toward AOC, whose face revealed a flicker of frustration, but also something more complicated, perhaps recognition. The crowd was no longer a united chorus of agreement. Instead, it was a patchwork of shifting emotions. Some faces glowed with newfound respect for the uninvited speaker. Others showed confusion or impatience, uneasy with the break in the script. Yet beneath it all was a sense that something important had just happened, something that couldn't be erased by a microphone or a security detail. AOC straightened her posture, took a deep breath, and addressed the crowd once again. But her tone was different now, measured, less fiery, as if the disruption had unsettled the confident rhythm she had commanded earlier. "Thank you, Karoline, for sharing your perspective," she said, voice steady but distant. "I hear you, and I believe all voices must be part of this conversation." There was a polite but noticeable murmur from the audience. Some supporters nodded, others exchanged skeptical glances. Karoline stepped down from her spot but did not retreat into the background. Instead, she remained visible, her presence a quiet defiance that seemed to challenge everyone in the room to reconsider what they had come to believe. Backstage, conversations buzzed feverishly. Journalists whispered about the unexpected interruption. Activists debated its impact. The summit organizers scrambled to regain control, worried about the narrative shifting away from the planned agenda. For Karoline, none of that mattered. Her focus was clear: the children she spoke for. Outside the ballroom, in the press area, the MSNBC crew who had been filming the event exchanged looks of surprise. They hadn't anticipated this moment of unscripted truth. Cameras that had captured AOC's commanding presence now sought out Karoline, the young woman who dared to speak without permission. Interviews were requested, social media feeds exploded. Clips of Karoline's speech circulated rapidly, sparking a national conversation about who gets to speak, whose voices are heard, and what it truly means to fight for educational equity. As the night deepened, Karoline found herself surrounded by reporters and supporters eager to understand her story. "Why did you do it?" one journalist asked. Karoline's answer was simple, yet profound. "For the kids," she repeated. "For every child who wakes up wondering if someone sees them, if someone cares. For the ones left behind by promises and policies. I couldn't stay silent." Meanwhile, inside the ballroom, the summit resumed its planned schedule, but the energy had shifted. The earlier momentum was replaced by a mix of reflection and quiet tension. AOC's next speakers addressed the crowd, but their words felt different, more cautious, less assured. The interruption had changed the tone, reminding everyone that the fight for education equity was not just about policy, but about real lives and real voices, even the unexpected ones. In the days that followed, the story of Karoline's one-minute speech became a touchstone for activists nationwide. Debates ignited over the role of grassroots voices in political discourse. Some hailed her courage, others criticized the breach of protocol. But for Karoline, the response was less important than the message. Her moment had been brief, but the impact was lasting. She had reminded a room full of powerful people that true change begins not with speeches scripted for applause, but with courage, honesty, and the willingness to be heard, even when it's inconvenient. As the summit closed and the attendees filed out, many carried a new question with them: who speaks for the children, and who will listen? Karoline knew her journey was just beginning. In the days that followed the National Education Equity Summit, Karoline Leavitt's one-minute speech echoed far beyond the polished walls of the New York Marriott marquee. What had been meant as a brief interruption had grown into a powerful moment that ignited conversations across the country. News outlets replayed the footage repeatedly. The quiet woman who rose uninvited, the tense pause before her words, and the shift in energy that followed. Social media buzzed with hashtags like the 1 minute for the kids and speak truth. Teachers shared stories of their own struggles. Students found a new sense of hope. Activists rallied behind a renewed push for genuine change. Karoline's life changed overnight. Interview requests flooded in from local stations to national talk shows. Each time she spoke, she returned to the same core message: education is a human right, not a political talking point. and the voices of those affected, the students, parents, and teachers, must lead the conversation. Yet with this newfound attention came challenges. Some criticized her for interrupting a planned event, accusing her of undermining the process. Others questioned her experience or motives, but Karoline remained grounded, her resolve strengthened by the stories she heard daily. Stories of classrooms without supplies, students facing hunger, and teachers stretched beyond their limits. Back in Washington, the summit's organizers and political figures debated the incident behind closed doors. For some, Karoline's speech was an uncomfortable reminder of the gap between political rhetoric and lived reality. For others, it was a call to listen more carefully, to open doors for more voices at the table. AOC herself faced scrutiny. Supporters defended her handling of the disruption, while critics suggested a missed opportunity for genuine dialogue. The event sparked a wider conversation about who controls the narrative and whose voices are allowed in political spaces. Despite the controversy, a new movement was quietly taking shape, one fueled by everyday people refusing to be sidelined. Karoline had become a symbol of courage and authenticity in a political landscape often criticized for its distance from real people's lives. In her hometown, Karoline began organizing forums where students, parents, and educators could share their experiences directly with policymakers. She collaborated with community groups to push for transparent, accountable reforms rooted in the realities faced by families every day. The media spotlight eventually dimmed, but Karoline's work only intensified. She knew true change would not come from a single speech or viral moment, but from sustained effort, patience, and unwavering commitment. One evening, months after the summit, Karoline stood in a local school auditorium filled with teachers and parents. She looked out over the crowd and saw faces marked by fatigue, but also hope. Change doesn't happen overnight, she told them, but every voice counts, every story matters, and together we can build a future where equity isn't just a word, but a reality. Her words were met with applause, not the roaring kind from a grand ballroom, but a sincere, determined clapping, the sound of a community ready to rise. In Washington, bills inspired by the summit's discussions were introduced, some incorporating feedback from grassroots groups like Karoline's. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but the dialogue had shifted. The children's voices had found champions. Karoline often thought back to that moment when she stood up, uninvited and without a microphone, and spoke simply but powerfully for the kids. That 1 minute was more than just a speech. It was a spark that reminded everyone, courage and truth can disrupt even the most carefully scripted stage. And sometimes that's all it takes to start a revolution. The weeks turned into months, and the ripple Karoline Leavitt created at the National Education Equity Summit continued to expand. What began as a single, quiet request to speak had blossomed into a movement that refused to be ignored. Karoline's face became familiar not just on screens, but in classrooms, town halls, and community centers across the nation. She wasn't a politician or a celebrity. She was an ordinary woman who dared to step up and speak truth to power. And that was exactly what inspired so many others to do the same. In the halls of Congress, the aftershocks of her speech were felt. Lawmakers who had once viewed education reform as a distant policy issue found themselves confronting stories they could no longer overlook. They heard from students who struggled to learn in overcrowded classrooms, teachers who fought burnout every day, and parents desperate for a better future for their children. Some politicians embraced the call for real change, advocating for increased funding, better teacher support, and programs that address the root causes of inequality. Others resisted, clinging to political divisions and bureaucratic inertia. But the conversation had shifted. The focus was no longer just on abstract policy. It was about people's lives. Karoline continued to work tirelessly, connecting grassroots advocates with political leaders, ensuring that the voices of those most affected by educational inequity were heard in the corridors of power. She championed initiatives that fostered inclusive dialogue and community-driven solutions. Her journey wasn't without setbacks. There were moments of frustration, times when progress seemed slow or impossible. Yet her courage never wavered. She reminded herself and others that lasting change is a marathon, not a sprint. In her own community, schools began to see tangible improvements. If you like this video, then subscribe.